I've been taking a look back at Alireza Firouzja's decisive games in Norway Chess 2020, and this is what happened when Alireza met Aryan Tari in round 5 of Norway Chess. So Alireza had white here, let's see what happened. So he kicked off with pawn to e4, we had e5 from Tari, and we went down this line known as the Italian game with the bishop coming to c4. So the bishop came to c5 from Tari, he gets it outside the pawn chain. We had pawn c3, preparing to support d4 later, b4 as well. Now we had knight to f6, and now pawn d3 from Alireza. He just holds off on the d4 at the moment, it's like a coiled spring attack. So pawn to d6, castles from white, h6 from black, a very standard move, taking away the g5 square, and we'll see Alireza do the same in a moment. So he goes rook e1, castles from black, and now he goes pawn h3, takes away g4, gives the king some luft. Now this pawn came to a6, sometimes black goes a5 there, very standard ideas, gives the bishop some room. Alireza goes a4, similar ideas, queenside expansion. Rook e8 now from black. This e-file is very key because as soon as one player goes d4 or d5, things will be opening up against those e-pawns. So the knight now came to d2. We had bishop to e6 from Tari, and this is a really important exchange. Alireza chops there, the rook recaptures, and black is very happy to trade off that dangerous light squared bishop. But Alireza still keeps an advantage here because he does have a bit of a space advantage in the centre. We note this pawn on c3, whereas black's got a knight there. So pawn b4 from Alireza. He expands on that queen side, kicks the bishop back, and now queen c2 continues that development. And Tari goes queen to d7. He does similar, wants to bring this a-rook into the game soon. And now rook b1 from Alireza, he prepares this b5 move at the right moment, and Tari now goes knight to e7. This standard maneuver coming to g6, clears the way for the c-pawn later, which could support d5, all very logical. And now Alireza makes an inaccurate move, and he said so after the game. So he plays pawn to d4 here, and the problem is that it leaves this e4 pawn quite weak. It's slightly premature. What he should do here really is go knight to f1. This is what Vishy Anand played, for example, against Peter Leko in 2020, same year. And the difference is that after knight to g6, knight g3, now white's transferred the knight round. It holds the e4 pawn, ready to go d4, but you're not blocking this bishop, you're not blocking the e-file in any way. You know, it's a better position for white. But what Alireza does is go d4 immediately, and now he's got long-term problems with the e4 pawn. So the knight span into g6, and now the problem here for Alireza is that if he tries knight f1, black can capture here, pawn recaptures, and this queen c6 move is really annoying. Lots of pressure on the pawn, the knight left its protection. Say the queen exchanged here, pawn recaptures, black has more than equalised, is actually doing better here. You've got this weak pawn, all the pieces are playing, this bishop's better than this one, not so good. So that's why we didn't have this knight f1 manoeuvre here. Instead Alireza went b5, keeps the queen out of c6, gets that queenside expansion going as well, of course, but black's doing fine now. Really Tari should take here though. I mean, the rook could recapture, let's say, then you can go c6, or you could go with the pawn, different options, but taking was best here for black, because after not taking, we'll see that this a6 pawn actually becomes a bit of a weakness later on. So knight h5 was played by Tari. He's heading for this f4 square, looks aggressive. Firouzja goes knight f1. He wants to cover the square with the bishop here, and we note also that the knight left f6 now when it came to h5. That's why Alireza can go knight f1. There's not so much pressure on e4 just for the moment. But rook a8 comes, pressures down that e-file once again. So Alireza takes here. He has to drum up some counterplay on the queen side. The pawn recaptured, and now he'd love to invade with his rook, bring it down to b7, but there's a very standard tactic for black, bishop b6. Sometimes you see this same kind of tactic with a knight, say it was on d7 or c8, coming to b6, trapping the rook. So always stay mindful of this with a rook invasion. And that's why Alireza starts with pawn a5. Now he is threatening to invade. There'd be no bishop b6. You also fix this a6 pawn as a weakness now. So queen c8 was played to cover the square, although c6 looks a lot more natural. Then once again you cover the square laterally, but okay, you also play an improving pawn move, prepare d5. But queen c8 played, and now Alireza has to figure out how to deal with this pressure against d4. The computer actually wants queen b3 here or queen b2 with the idea that you're bringing the queen to the b file after black takes here. Different way to play. But what Alireza did was bishop to e3. And now he is giving this e4 pawn. So Tari takes on d4. Alireza recaptures. And now best here for black was not taking the pawn which Tari did, but actually going pawn to c5. And the key thing to understand here is that you liberate this backwards pawn. The queen can't sit on c6, which we saw in the game, and black just has no issues. All of your pieces are now playing, tons of space to gallop into, no problems at all. What Tari does is take on e4, but then queen c6 comes, just sitting on the position, stymieing this backwards pawn, looking at this weakness. And now Tari plays a pawn sacrifice, which might look slightly strange, but this variation shows why he plays it. So say you go knight g to f4 here, and the knight comes to d2, kicking the rook. Say it comes back to e6. Well, now the queen can invade on b7 here. And you want to move this queen to a8 if possible, keep it active, looking in this direction, but then white can take on a6. This is the problem. Now if we run it back here, I'm showing this because it explains why Tari in this position didn't play the knight into f4, instead he played pawn d5. So he's actually giving a pawn back if Alireza wants it. And the idea is that now after the knight comes to d2, which Alireza played, the rook can come back to e6. So it laterally defends this a6 pawn. Now if you get this whole queen invasion line, the queen can come to a8, no problems at all. So Alireza picks up this d5 pawn. So the material is now level, but white has the pressure here as we can see. With that nice central pawn, black still has the issue of trying to liberate this one. And now the queen is attacking the knight here, so Tari has to take care of that, and he really should have jumped into f4 here. Of course, it just looks visually like a much more active move. Black can try and get some play going after queen b7, let's say queen a8. You know, you've got something going on the light squares at least. But what Tari does is go knight to f6 here. So it kicks the queen in here, and now he really puts a nail in the coffin. Instead of actually playing this queen to a8, keeping some hopes alive of some activity, he plays bishop to b8 here. And this looks really miserable because Alireza can just chop on c8, the rook recaptures, and he invades with rook to b7 here. Really tough for Tari now. So he drops this rook back here. On a good day, he's probably trying to go pawn c6, rook c7. If takes, then wiggle the bishop out like this. But it's all just too slow because after knight to b3, this one's heading for the c5 square. It will look at a6. So that had to be covered. Knight c5 anyway. We had this exchange, but these pawns are now really cramping the black position. So pawn c6 was played, trying to give that bishop some room. It's completely entombed, but now simply rook to b6, using the weakness of the last move, hitting this a6 pawn. Now black centralized the knight. We had an exchange here. The bishop recaptured, and Alireza picked up on a6. So he's a clean pawn ahead, but Tari's trying to mix it up. He goes bishop to d4. They're heading towards time control. Now there's a pin against the rook here, so you can't take that one. So king f1 from Alireza. The rook came to e4, and now simply captures here. The rook recaptured, and this is quite instructive. Instead of passively going rook to c1 here, defending the c5 pawn from the rook, then black could go rook a4, coming behind your passed pawn. Not to say this isn't winning, it's just not as good. Alireza goes rook to a1, coming immediately behind the passed pawn, allowing rook c4, then going rook b6, letting black pick up here. And although black has restored the material, white is still better in this position because pawn a6, he's even happy to trade off a pair of rooks here. The pawn recaptures because this endgame is just crushing. Pawn a7, rook a8, that rook is completely stuck, and now the two kings march in. The black king actually gets to this b pawn just in time, but rook a6 check, king b7, king captures here. This is hopeless for black. Black is basically zugzwanged. So pawn h5 was played, but it allows a simple finish. Rook b6 check, the king captured, and after rook a6 check, king b7, exchange here, this king came to c6 and Tari resigned. The white king's marching in, it'll gobble up the pawns, it's game over. If you enjoyed this game and want to see Alireza against Aronian in an Armageddon, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.